Hello everyone, I thought I would just film a video about how I paint my blue Roan horses. And today we have this Breyer stablemate Rainer that I was going to paint a blue Roan. So let's get right into it. I'm first going to start by removing all of his imperfections, and this also includes the Breyer logo on the bottom. So I'm going to take some sandpaper and just lightly rub that off until his stomach is all flat. It's important not to skip this step, so in the future you'll have a nice, clean, realistic horse that is all yours. So here I am just finishing up his sanding, and another thing I also love to use are files. And I got this cheap set off of Amazon, and it gets in those little tiny places that sandpaper can't get sometimes. So it's absolutely great for sanding down hard to reach places. So now that the logo is finally sanded off, we can feel for any last little areas and just touch up other seams. Breyers usually have a couple seam splits here and there from the molding process, so it's best to remove these. Another key thing to realize is the different sandpaper grits there are out there and how they affect the sanding of your horse. A lower grit will normally make more rough indents in the plastic, and a finer grit will make them nice and smooth. So I recommend getting a really high grit sandpaper if you want to get in those little areas without causing nicks. The next thing I do is rinse my entire horse off to get all the little bits of plastic and paint away. So when I do my primer, they won't show up and cause a problem. Instead of drying my horse off with any sort of towel, I lay them out so no bits of fuzzies can get in the primer either. For my primer, my ultimate favorite is this Duplicolor Sandable Primer. I also recommend using gloves when primering so your hands aren't covered in white paint for a few days. Next, I'm going to follow the back of my primer can, and it'll tell you where and how you want to spray it. So I'm going to go ahead and shake it up really well so it's all even, and then go in back and forth strokes over my horse. For this tutorial, having a solid base of white primer is going to be your best option because I will use a masking method that makes painting whites so much easier. So this is one side finished, and we just have a very thin layer, and we're going to go and do the same on the other side. Another thing to have that I also recommend while priming is wearing a mask to protect your lungs and having a proper ventilated space so the fumes don't get caught up in the air. So here is a great first layer of a horse, and the reason I love this primer so much is you can sand it. This little guy had a lot of flaws that I needed to fix earlier, so I was able to just sand them down and fix them. So as you can see, his second layer is a lot better. There are nowhere near as many flaws as there was the first time, and so he will be ready to paint soon. I usually lay the model down to prime the areas that I covered up with my hand. If you get any flaws like that little one right there, wait for it to fully dry and then lightly take it off. The paints I will be using today are these Vallejo Model Air paints, and I love them so much because I don't have to worry about mixing and getting the right consistency to go through my airbrush. My airbrush is the Iwata Eclipse, and I love this so much. I just recently upgraded and it's been working out great for me. So here I am just preparing my airbrush for paint, and I definitely recommend getting a pot to either rest it in or to put your excess paint into. So my next thing is a little bit of a secret, but I use this liquid latex to basically mask my whites. So any areas that I want white on the horse, like markings, I will use this nail polish to actually make that possible. So I paint a little bit on, and it dries like a thick kind of glaze, and then you can just peel it off and whatever is underneath will be white. So this is a lifesaver if you don't want to paint whites like me and find them very tedious. Breyer also uses this similar method but with stickers, so that means also any sort of masking tape would work fine for this as well if you don't have any liquid latex, but I will leave a link in the description if you would like to try it. It is possible to get little details like face markings with this, but there is definitely no way of doing herring, which is the downfall to this method. And of course, if you don't have any sort of masking method, you can just paint on your whites afterwards. So here is what he looks like. I like that it shows up blue so you know where you put it, and we're just gonna lay him out to let that cure for a few minutes and then start airbrushing directly over our little white markings. So the first color I use is this light gray, and I go ahead and squeeze it into my airbrush and test it out always first. I'm gonna go around on his back and legs just to get a base layer, and I usually like to leave it white in his flank area where a lot of blue roans have lighter colors there. So this is what his first layer looks like. It is lightly shaded, but mainly just a base layer to get us started. Now that we've finished with our first color, we're going to move on, which also means we have to clean our airbrush. Cleaning your airbrush is such an important step to making sure it'll last, and to be honest, I ruined a few cheap airbrushes just from my lack of cleaning, so definitely make sure it's cleaned out really good. So once I'm done cleaning it out, I will start with my next color, which is this dark sea gray. And I start by going on his darkest points, which are on his legs, his face, and a little bit of his back. So the next color I'll be using is this dark brown, and some blue roans actually have a little bit of brown in them, so I like to add this touch. And our final color is going to be black, and I'm going to use this on the darkest point, so like the tip of his nose, his eyes, and the bottom of his feet. So now my horse is completely finished airbrushed, and on to the fun part. So to make the little speckles blue roans have, I get a paintbrush and a little dish to put some black paint on, and I actually flick little bits of paint at him. I highly recommend doing this on the side first before you do it on your model so there's no big globs. Depending on the type of blue roan you're really looking to paint, it will depend on the size of your speckles, and I really wanted mine fine for this guy. So I'm just going to go ahead and lightly go around his whole body, just flicking it and being careful not to get too much paint on the brush so there won't be massive mistakes. It's also a good idea to do a matte finish right before you do the speckles, so if you do mess up, you can easily wipe it off and it won't ruin your whole paint job. So this is what his final look on this side looks like. It's very small speckles, but I think it adds a lot to the blue roan feel. Now you're going to want to do the same thing on the other side of the horse and make them as even looking as possible. So now his coat is completely done, yay! And we can get on to adding the final details like the mane, markings, eyes, and tail. To take off the liquid latex, I use a small pair of tweezers, or pliers will work sometimes, to gently peel them off, and I normally start at the base and kind of scratch it, and this will get me a little grab to be able to pull it off. So once I finally get it all peeled off, I just slowly bring it upwards and it takes the paint right off and leaves the primer underneath. So this method is great, even though sometimes you can get little flicks like that, and I just fix those with a pair of tweezers and use my fingers sometimes to flatten them down. So now I go ahead and do this to all other parts where I lay down the masking tape, including their legs. And this is great for not painting whites because I remember whites took me so long on the legs because you have to get on all the angles. So this is very convenient. So once I finally got his blaze off, I can reveal what he looks like. So I think this method turned out so great. We had a little mishap on the legs, but that's because I accidentally scraped off the primer, which be careful not to do. But overall it worked out so good, and we can just touch up those little areas when we are adding all the details, like the mane and tail and eyes. I forgot to film this part, but it's also a really good idea to matte finish your horse after the airbrushing step. For all the details, I usually use a cloth to clean off my brushes, some brushes of course, water, and acrylic paint. So I'm first going to start by painting the mane and tail a solid black color. And I just go and water down my black paint and just lightly go over it multiple times. It usually takes 2 to 3 coats to get a nice look, and then I also do one final third coat to make sure it's entirely opaque. If you want to avoid getting any oils on your horse, I recommend using some sort of soft cloth or paper towel to hold them while you're painting. While the tail is drying, I then start on the mane and do the same exact thing with very thin coats and the small edge of my paintbrush to get as detailed as possible. After I finish a few coats on the mane and tail, I then start on the hooves, which I use this light peach color and go over any hooves that have a white marking connected to them. So when I finish the hooves, it usually takes me 3 to 4 coats, and then I make sure to paint the bottoms as well and lay the horse to dry in an upward position so the hooves don't get smeared. Next, I go in with some white acrylic paint, and I highly recommend, if you're doing a lot of white painting, to get a nice quality one so it'll go on a lot easier than maybe a cheaper brand would. So with the white acrylic paint, I'm going to go in and touch up any of the areas that I scraped off the primer, and this takes 2 to 3 coats just to get a solid layer so no of that undercolor is showing through. Another thing to keep in mind when using white paint is to make sure it goes on thin, so this way no paint streaks show up and the markings look very smooth, and you can either do this with paint thinner or water. I also use this same color to water it down and mix it with white to create a little bit of pinking on the nose. For my hooves, I use Prismacolor colored pencils to add detail, and I think it makes it so much easier than getting out a whole bunch of paint and trying to paint tiny little streaks. So I go up and down with my colored pencil and left and right to create a realistic hoof effect. I also use the colored pencils to create a realistic bottom of the hoof as well, and this adds a lot of fun detail. For the eye, I usually use a very tiny paintbrush, but you can also use another one with just forming the end to a tiny point. And then I go in with that same cream color and make an eye white. For the pupil, I start with a big black circle and I just paint in where I want my eye to be looking. So I leave a little bit of white on either one side or the other, depending on where I want the horse to look. So now I'm going to do the same on the other side and paint the pupil in the back, leaving the white in the front to make it appear like he's looking backwards almost. For the next part of the eye, I'm going to go ahead and take a lighter brown color and fill in the same pupil, leaving a little bit of that black ring on the outside. To finish the eye off, I'm going to make a tiny rectangular pupil or oval out of just plain black paint and lay that pretty much in the middle of our eye. So next I'm going to go ahead and get some of my gray paint and add little details to the face and ears to make it pop even more. So I usually get a thin line of gray and go along the ears to make it stand out and look like he has hair. If you have any hooves that still need to be painted gray, like this one because it's connected to his black leg, I also do that now as well. Since a little bit of my horse's mane went into the white marking, I also painted it white. For the detail on the black hoof, I go ahead and take my black colored pencil and create little lines just like I did with the other three. Next, I use that same gray color I made earlier and paint on chestnuts. And those usually go right above the back of the knee on the front and below the hock in the back. Another thing that I like to do with the colored pencils is create veining, and this adds so much realism even though it's such a small thing to do. So I go in and create little veins where I look up reference photos and find horse veins. After the veining, I usually go outside and matte finish him with very thin coats just so it doesn't get too shiny, and then we're almost done. So I love looking at the color in the sunlight because it brings out it so much better, and this is what he looks like after the matte finish. So you can see there's a little bit of shine, but it's not like overdone, and that's what we're looking for. For almost all my horses, I use Mod Podge to gloss the eyes and nostrils, and occasionally I will do the hooves. For the Mod Podge, I recommend using an old brush so it doesn't get damaged, but also make sure it's small so you can get in those small areas like the eyes. With the gloss finished, our horse is done. I usually let it dry for about 5 minutes and then it'll all clear up and it won't look fuzzy. So this is what he looks like. So I hope you enjoyed this video and this helped you a little bit with painting some stablemates. Have fun everybody and enjoy!